Hey guys, tonight we're opening a room that has been locked for over 140 years. Not locked by accident. Not locked because nobody thought to look. Locked by a series of choices made around one of the most beloved writers in American history. A woman who spent more than a decade shaping frontier childhood, family memory and pioneer survival into meticulous, tender, almost sacred detail. The exact taste of maple candy hardening on snow. The scratch of wool against a child's wrist on a cold Dakota night. The sound of her father's fiddle cutting through a darkness that might otherwise have swallowed the whole family whole. She wrote 8 books. 8. Over 1,600 published pages. She described a log cabin in Wisconsin with the smell of pine resin and wood smoke still living in the prose. She described a dugout dug into the side of a creek bank in Minnesota, where the family watched the spring melt through the single small window and hoped the walls would hold. She described a surveyor's house on the frozen Dakota prairie, a covered wagon at dusk on a Kansas road, a one-room schoolhouse where she taught children younger than herself through a blizzard winter. She wrote about grasshoppers that ate the crops and the light. She wrote about blizzards so long and dark that the family burned twisted hay for heat. She wrote about love and hardship and a father's boundless optimism and a mother's quiet, relentless endurance. She wrote all of it. She wrote it with a clarity and a grace that have kept those books alive across generations of readers who grew up with them and then gave them to their own children and grandchildren. The Little House books are, by any reasonable measure, one of the great achievements of American autobiographical fiction for children. And then she skipped a year. A missing year. Possibly close to 14 months depending on how the surviving records are reconstructed. Gone. Completely. As though someone had reached into the narrative and simply cut the pages out. The town was called Burr Oak, Iowa. Here is what makes tonight's story unlike anything you've heard about Laura Ingalls Wilder before. Burr Oak is not a theory. It is not speculation. It is not the creative interpretation of an overzealous biographer with an axe to grind. It is documented, verified, cross-referenced across multiple sources, and sitting right there, in the hotel record, in county death records, in local histories, in later scholarship, and in Laura's own manuscript that she did not publish, waiting for the person who was willing to stop and ask the right question. Laura Ingalls. Wilder was 9 years old when her family rolled into Burr Oak on a wagon in the fall of 1876. She was 10. Possibly close to 11 when they left. In between, she attended school in the Iowa town, lived in the master's hotel and then in rented rooms near a saloon, watched her father take work in a building that belonged to someone else, and lived through something so heavy, so shaped by grief and poverty, and the specific shame of fallen circumstances, that the published Little House books would later leave it out entirely. A baby brother was born before the family reached Burr Oak. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. They called him Freddie. He was 9 months old when he died. Laura put him into Pioneer Girl, the private autobiographical manuscript most readers never saw. But when the Little House books were shaped for publication, Freddie disappeared from the public story. In all 8 Little House books, Freddie Ingalls does not exist. Not a single word, not a shadow, not a breath of acknowledgement that this boy was ever born. Before we go any further into this story, if you are someone who grew up with these books, if Laura Ingalls Wilder's voice is sewn into your earliest memory of what it meant to love reading, if you learned from her books what a Dakota winter felt like, or what a prairie looked like at sunrise before the world was fully awake, this story is for you. Because what we are about to discover tonight does not take anything away from Laura. It does not make the fiddle music less real, or the long winter less devastating. What it does is make her human in a way that the books, for all their genius, never quite allowed. If the histories that live in the gaps, the silences, the things the famous chose not to say, the rooms that stayed locked, if that kind of story speaks to you, please subscribe. This channel exists for exactly this. The histories that were almost lost, told with all the weight they deserve from the beginning. Now. Let us start not with Burr Oak, not with the hotel, and not with Iowa. Let us start with a summer in Minnesota when everything the Ingalls family had worked for, every seed, every acre, every prayer, and every plan, simply stopped growing. Keep this image in the back of your mind as we go through tonight's story. Laura Ingalls Wilder, in 1930, sitting at her writing desk at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri, composing what would become the Little House books. Her pen moves carefully across the page. She's 63 years old. She has spent years thinking about how to tell this story, which parts to keep, which parts to let breathe, and which parts to do something else with entirely. She writes about Wisconsin. She writes about Kansas. She writes about Plum Creek and Silver Lake and the hard, beautiful, brutal Dakota winters. The pen moves with the confidence of a woman who has lived the things she's describing. And then, at a certain point, there is a gap. The narrative jumps. The family appears to have moved from one chapter of their lives to the next without stopping anywhere in between. She knew exactly what she was doing. She always knew exactly what she was doing. Tonight we find out why. To understand what Burr Oak meant to the Ingalls family, what it meant to arrive there, what it meant to leave, and above all what it meant decades later to decide it had never happened, you have to understand who they actually were in 1876. Not the television version, not the golden-lit memory that America built around them. The real version, with all the complications intact. Charles Ingalls was 40 years old in 1876. He had been moving his family west and north and south and west again for the better part of a decade, chasing the particular American dream that said free land was freedom, and freedom was the whole point of everything the country had been built to provide. He had tried Wisconsin, where Laura was born in 1867 in a little log house near Pepin. He had tried Kansas, where the family settled on the Osage Diminished Reserve, land the government was in the process of clearing for white settlement, and which the family had to leave when the government decided they had arrived too soon. He had tried Minnesota twice, and he would try it again. The portrait of Charles Ingalls in the Little House books, Pa, is one of the most enduring in American literature. He is warm, musical, capable, eternally optimistic, the kind of man who could make a cheerful story out of any disaster and play the fiddle at the end of it that made you believe the story. Every depiction of Charles in the books is filtered through the love of a daughter who adored him, and that love is not false. It is one of the most genuine things in all 8 volumes. But the real Charles Ingalls was also a man of deeply unreliable economic judgment. He was not irresponsible. He worked hard. He cared for his family with everything he had, but he moved. He always moved. When a crop failed, he did not dig in deeper. He pointed west. When a venture didn't pan out, he found another one somewhere else. When the circumstances of a place became too heavy, he loaded the wagon. There was something in Charles Ingalls that required forward motion the way other men required steady ground, and the consequence of that need, played out across more than 16 years of marriage by 1876, was a family that had accumulated almost nothing except the memories they would eventually mine for literature. By 1874, the family had settled along the banks of Plum Creek near Walnut Grove, Minnesota. This is the setting Laura immortalized in On the Banks of Plum Creek. The sod dug out in the earth near the water, the creek running silver in summer, the town close enough for Sunday church, the school close enough for the girls to walk. It was, in the particular way of these places at this moment in history, genuinely beautiful and genuinely precarious in equal measure. The precariousness arrived that same summer in the form of a cloud. In the summer of 1874, the Rocky Mountain grasshopper, Melanoplus spretus, descended on the American Midwest in swarms of such density that the historical record reads like something from the Old Testament. Farmers in Iowa, Minnesota, Kansas, Nebraska, and the Dakotas watched the sky turn from clear blue to a living brown-black mass that blocked the sun and dropped to earth with a sound described variously as rain, as hail, as the pages of 1,000 books being torn simultaneously. The locusts covered every surface. They ate the wheat down to the ground. They ate the harnesses left hanging in the barn. They ate the wooden handles of tools left outside overnight. They landed on children walking to school and covered them completely in a chittering, clicking blanket of legs and wings. Charles Ingalls lost his wheat crop. Not part of it, all of it. The family survived that first winter partly on credit at the Walnut Grove store, partly on Charles walking east to find any wage work he could carry home, and partly on the specific resourcefulness that Caroline Ingalls possessed in abundance, the ability to stretch almost nothing into something that kept a family alive. Laura wrote about all of this in On the Banks of Plum Creek. She wrote it with the careful, respectful honesty that marks the series at its best. She did not pretend the grasshoppers were not terrible. She did not pretend the fear was not real. She did not paste a cheerful conclusion over an experience that was genuinely frightening. What she gave the books was the emotional truth of surviving it. What she did not write was what came next. Because the grasshoppers came back. In 1875, they returned. In June of 1876, local Walnut Grove history records them present for the entire month, covering the fields, destroying what Charles and Caroline had planted with the desperate, careful hope of people who had already survived 2 seasons of crop loss and were beginning to run out of ways to absorb another. Repeated crop destruction in a farming economy where the entire year's income depended almost entirely on what the ground produced. Somewhere in the summer of 1876, Charles Ingalls made a decision. He sold the preemption claim on Plum Creek, the land he had worked for 2 years and in which the family had invested the better part of their identity as homesteaders, on July 10, 1876, to a man named Abraham Keller. The price was probably modest. The family was broke, not embarrassed about it broke. Actually, quietly, completely broke. And there was an offer waiting. William Stedman, a man the family knew from Walnut Grove, had acquired a hotel in a small Iowa river town called Burr Oak. He needed someone to help run it. Charles Ingalls needed income. The offer was for Charles to co-manage the Burr Oak house, sometimes called the Masters Hotel after its previous owner William J. Masters, in exchange for a wage and the use of rooms in the building for the family. It was not the frontier dream. It was, in the bluntest possible terms, the opposite of the frontier dream. Wage labour. Someone else's building. Work that built nothing, claimed nothing, and put the great enterprise of Charles Ingalls' life, the homestead, the land, the legacy, exactly nowhere. But the children needed to eat, and the offer was real, and the farm was sold, and Iowa was waiting. The wagon went east. Before the family reached Iowa, they stopped in Minnesota. Not the Walnut Grove they had just left, but a small community in Wabasha County, near the town of South Troy, where Charles's brother Peter Ingalls and his wife Eliza were living. The plan was to wait there until the fall, when the timing was right to make the move south to Iowa, and then travel together to Burr Oak. They arrived at Uncle Peter's with a baby. Charles Frederick Ingalls, Freddie, had been born on November 1st, 1875, in Walnut Grove, the first son the family had produced. He was 9 months old that summer. He was, by all the evidence of how families in this era described infant sons they were hoping to raise on working land, a child wrapped in a specific concrete hope. Another pair of hands, eventually a continuation of the name, a different kind of future than the one the daughters could build in the gender economy of 1870s frontier farming. But beyond the cultural weight, and this is the part that gets buried under historical analysis and needs to be recovered, he was a baby. He was warm and heavy, and someone had to hold him, and he cried, and he was learning, the way 9-month-old babies learn, to recognize faces and reach for things and announce his presence in the household with the particular authority that very small people possess when they want something. Caroline and Charles loved him the way you love a first son, completely, protectively, with the specific terror of knowing how thin the margin was between a child being alive and a child being gone. Freddie got sick at Uncle Peter's. Laura described it in Pioneer Girl, like the unedited memoir she composed in 1930. She wrote that the doctor came. She wrote that her brother's condition did not improve. She wrote in the plain, direct prose of someone who has carried the memory for more than 50 years and still cannot fully dress it in ceremony. One terrible day he straightened out his little body and died. Charles Frederick Ingalls died on August 27, 1876. The death was recorded in the Wabasha County Death Register, Book A, page 135. The cause listed is diarrhea, a brutal clinical word for the kind of illness that moved through infants in a world without the tools to stop it. No intravenous fluids, no antibiotics, no paediatric emergency medicine. A child who could not keep water down had, effectively, no medical recourse. Other children in the county died of the same cause that year. The register shows multiple infants, ranging in age from 28 days to a year. He died near the Zumbro River in Minnesota, and his burial was connected to that South Troy area, though the exact grave location is not secure enough to state with certainty. Not in Iowa, not in Burr Oak, in Minnesota, in the churchyard of the community near South Troy, in soil that belonged to his uncle's neighbours, in a state the family was leaving. They buried him in borrowed ground. And then, because the hotel was waiting in Iowa, because the money was gone, because the only alternative to going forward was not going forward at all, which was not something the 1870s frontier offered as a viable option for a family with 3 living daughters, a mother carrying another child who would be born the next spring, and no income. They loaded the wagon again. They drove south. The town of Burr Oak sits in the northeastern corner of Iowa, tucked into the upper valley of the upper Iowa River in Winneshiek County, right where the train stops being flat, wide, sky-dominated prairie and starts being something more complicated. Hills, limestone bluffs, creek beds cutting down through wooded valleys, the kind of landscape that looks more like Wisconsin or southern Minnesota than the open grasslands most people picture when they hear the word Iowa. In autumn, when the Ingalls family would have arrived, the valley would have been red and gold with turning oak leaves, the river running cold and clear over flat stones, the ridges above town catching the last of the October light before dusk came early. Under different circumstances it might have been beautiful, probably was beautiful even as it was, but they had just buried Freddie, and circumstances have a way of editing the landscape. Burr Oak was not a romantic frontier outpost. It was not a heroic homesteading settlement perched on the edge of civilization, with the weight of the American future on its shoulders. It was a working town, the kind that existed by the hundreds across the Midwest in 1876. Modest and functional and utterly unremarkable to the people who lived there, and completely uninterested in the drama of its own ordinariness. It had a post office. It had a church. It had a school. It had a mill and several stores and a small constellation of businesses serving the farming community in the surrounding valley. It had saloons, and it had the Masters Hotel. The Burr Oak House, called the Masters Hotel after William J. Masters, was a mid-19th century story-and-a-half wood-frame hotel with a full-width front porch and a raised basement, sitting on State Street in Burr Oak's commercial block. It had been built specifically as a traveller's hotel for the road traffic moving through the valley, and by 1876 it had been in operation for 20 years, a solid, workmanlike building that had seen its share of frontier commerce and human passage without acquiring any particular distinction. William Stedman, the Walnut Grove connection who had arranged the whole arrangement, now owned and was trying to manage the hotel. Stedman was, by the evidence available, a practical man in a practical situation. He had a hotel, he needed someone with the energy and capability to actually run the day-to-day operations, and Charles Ingalls, who was charming, capable with people, and desperately in need of income, fit the bill. Charles Ingalls, hotel manager. Let that sit for a moment, because Charles Ingalls, in the mythology that his daughter spent 50 years constructing, is the man with the fiddle and the covered wagon and the prairie ahead of him and the log he is splitting with the easy confidence of a man who knows exactly what his hands are for. He is a hunter and a farmer and a builder. He is the physical embodiment of the American pioneer ideal, resourceful, optimistic, free, moving west. Hotel manager is not a profession that appears anywhere in that mythology, and yet there is his name in the Burr Oak records. There it is, documented in multiple independent sources, confirming that Charles Philip Ingalls of Walnut Grove, Minnesota, managed the Burr Oak House Hotel on State Street in Burr Oak, Iowa, during the fall of 1876 and into 1877. The hotel ledger kept what the books erased. Now, the building. The Masters Hotel is still on State Street in Burr Oak, still standing on its original foundation, exactly where it was when Laura Ingalls was 9 years old, and climbing the stairs to the family's rooms after a school day in the fall of 1876. It is, as of this recording, the only childhood home of Laura Ingalls Wilder that remains on its original site. That distinction matters. Other places from her childhood survive through reconstructions, relocated buildings, museums, markers or landscapes. But Burr Oak gives the story something rare. An original building still standing in the very place the published books skipped. The Burr Oak Hotel survived. It was purchased in 1973 by a group called Laura Ingalls Wilder Park Inc., who restored the dilapidated building and opened it as a museum. It was added to the National Register of Historic Places on January 27, 1983. Locals and Wilder scholars call it the missing link in the Little House series. The website for the Laura Ingalls Wilder Park and Museum, right there on the internet, describes Burr Oak as the gap in the Little House geography, the town between Walnut Grove and De Smet that the books simply skip. The building waited 100 years for the story to come back to it. That is the kind of patience that history exercises when it knows it has the receipts. The Ingalls family arrived in Burr Oak in the early fall of 1876. The wagon rolled into town carrying Charles, Caroline, Mary, 11 years old, Laura, 9, Carrie, 6, and the absence of Freddie, which travelled with them as surely as anything packed in the wagon bed. They moved into the hotel. The specific arrangement of the family's living quarters within the hotel has been described with varying degrees of detail by different biographers. What is consistent is that the family occupied rooms in the building itself, while the rough saloon atmosphere associated with Burr Oak pressed close enough to the hotel world to become part of the family's memory of that year. Now this requires a moment of context that is easy to gloss over if you are approaching this story from a modern perspective, but which is absolutely essential to understanding the Ingalls family's experience of Burr Oak. There was a saloon next door, close enough to matter every day. In the social and moral world of the 1870s Midwest, particularly the world as it was understood by a deeply religious Protestant woman like Caroline Ingalls, a saloon was not a neutral feature of the commercial landscape. The temperance movement was not a minor cultural footnote in this period. It was a major social force, drawing its most passionate support from exactly the demographic Caroline represented: rural, Protestant, morally serious women who understood, from the evidence of their own communities and families, what alcohol did to men and the families dependent on them. The Woman's Christian Temperance Union was founded in 1874, the same year the Ingalls arrived at Plum Creek, and was already organising across the Midwest with the energy of a movement that believed it was fighting for the survival of the family unit itself. Caroline Ingalls was not a temperance activist in any organised sense. There is no record of her involvement in any formal movement. But she was a woman formed by the values that fueled those movements, and she was now living in a hotel world with the saloon close by. Not as a distant fact, as a daily pressure. The saloon was close enough to the family's working life that Burr Oak could never feel like the clean, self-owned pioneer home Caroline wanted for her children. The sounds of men drinking, the talk, the boots on floorboards, the particular social atmosphere of a frontier saloon on a Saturday evening in a small Iowa town, those sounds were part of the household. Charles helped run the hotel and did the work the arrangement required, because the work was the income, and the income was the children's survival. There is no moral complexity in that decision on his part. He was a father doing what fathers in desperate circumstances do, which is exactly whatever the circumstances require. But the shame was real. Not everyone's shame, Charles's shame specifically. This is important. Charles Ingalls' self-image was rooted in independence, in land ownership, in the specific dignity of a man who built what he lived in and grew what he ate, and answered to nobody about either. Working in someone else's building, in a transaction, Charles had not chosen, but had been pushed into by a string of catastrophes outside his control. That cost something. Not his character, not his love for his family, his pride, his sense of who he was supposed to be. The fiddle still played in the evenings, almost certainly. Charles was not a man who could sit in silence when the silence got heavy. But the music in Burr Oak had a different background than it had at Plum Creek. Laura went to school in Burr Oak. This is documented in the Pioneer Girl manuscript. She wrote about the Burr Oak schoolhouse, about her teacher, about the particular social landscape of a new school entered mid-year by children who were obviously not from there and obviously not planning to stay forever. She was 9 years old in fall 1876, turning 10 in February 1877. Mary was 11. They walked to school together in the mornings. The school would have been a one-room affair. This was universal in rural Midwest communities of this era. One teacher managing students ranging from primary grade beginners through whatever level of advanced instruction a small farming community's children needed. Older students helping younger ones with their recitation. The school year structured around the agricultural calendar that pulled children out in planting and harvest seasons regardless of where the arithmetic lessons had reached. Laura, by every available account, was a quick, capable student. She had been reading since early childhood. The family's reading aloud together in the evenings, which Pa's fiddle music supplemented, and which Ma's quiet, steady presence anchored, had produced a girl who loved language the way some children love outdoor play. She thought fast. She retained everything. She was, in the schoolroom she passed through during a childhood full of movement and disruption, consistently one of the sharper students in the room. She was also, in Burr Oak, very aware of being the new child. The daughter of the family that was staying at the hotel with the bar, in a town where everyone already knew everyone else and had known them for years. This is the specific social burden of the perpetually relocated child. You arrive already defined by the circumstances of your arrival, already behind in the invisible knowledge about who matters, who to sit with, who to avoid, which teacher has a sense of humour and which one does not. You learn fast or you fall behind, socially, in ways that follow you all year. Laura learned fast, she always did. But she was carrying something that her classmates in Burr Oak were not carrying. She was 9 years old, she had just lost her baby brother on the road south. She was living in a hotel setting shadowed by the saloon next door while her father worked for wages, and she was smart enough and observant enough to understand, in the wordless but absolute way that perceptive children understand adult circumstances, that something about this year was wrong in a way that nobody was naming directly. The particular intelligence of the Little House books, the emotional precision, the ability to hold grief and joy in the same sentence without one cancelling out the other, the deep understanding of what it cost to maintain dignity under pressure, that intelligence was being assembled in real time in a classroom in Burr Oak, Iowa, in the fall and winter of 1876. The girl who would write those books was being made here, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure nobody knew it. There is a hotel register from the Burr Oak house. It exists. It has been examined by biographers and local historians and archival researchers over the decades since the hotel was rediscovered as a Wilder site. And in that register, in the documentation of who managed this building and lived within its walls during the period in question, Charles Ingalls' name appears. I'm going to come back to this specific image later tonight. This ledger, this name, this physical evidence that the year happened no matter what the books say. Because the question of what survives in erasure, and how, and why, is one of the most important questions this story asks. Keep that image, the ledger, the name, the receipt that history keeps when it knows you tried to destroy the evidence. There is a question the Little House books never ask directly, even though every careful reader can feel it running underneath the surface of the narrative like cold water under ice. What did it cost Charles Ingalls to be Charles Ingalls? Not financially, not physically. The books give you plenty of the physical cost. The winters, the work, the endless reconstruction of shelters that were never quite permanent enough. What the books do not give you, except in oblique, carefully controlled glimpses, is the interior cost. The accounting that a man makes when the life he imagined and the life he is actually living are separated by a distance too large to cross. Charles Ingalls had a specific, detailed self-image. It is right there in the books, running through every chapter like the fiddle music itself. A man of the land, moving west, free and capable, and always ahead of the settled world, building something that was going to last. He is always, in the books, the man who can fix the problem, kill the game, play the music, calm the fear. He is the emotional centre of the family's resilience. When he plays in the evenings, it is a statement. We are still here, we are still together, this is still worth everything. That man was now helping manage a hotel in Iowa, with a saloon next door and no land of his own. He was not building anything. He was not homesteading. He was not moving west. He was in Iowa, which is east of Minnesota, which is east of where he had been pointing his whole adult life. He was working for wages in someone else's establishment, sleeping in rooms in a building that no amount of hard work would ever make his own. The biographers who have written most carefully about Charles Ingalls tend to describe him with a complicated affection, acknowledging the charm and the music and the genuine love alongside the repeated failures of economic judgment that defined his practical life. He was not a bad man. He was not even, in any meaningful sense, an irresponsible one. He just kept moving when staying would have been more profitable, kept dreaming past the point where the dream needed to be replaced by a workable plan. Burr Oak was where the distance between the dream and the reality was most nakedly visible. In the hotel, in the bar, in the wage ledger that documented Charles Ingalls as an employee rather than an owner, in the Iowa address that was east of everything he had been working toward. All of it was a mirror he had no choice but to look at every morning. Caroline knew, she always knew, that is one of the great unspoken truths in the Little House books, that Marcy's pa clearly loves him anyway, and makes the love the point rather than the clarity. But clarity is not the same as agreement, and in Burr Oak, with 3 daughters, a pregnancy, the grief of Freddie, and rented rooms in a hotel world shadowed by a nearby saloon, Caroline Ingalls' clarity must have been almost unbearable. There is no surviving record of a single conversation between them about any of this, no letters, no diary entries. The silence of the historical record here is so complete that it almost feels deliberate, as though the people themselves knew that certain things were not for the archive. What we have instead is what Laura saw, and Laura in 1876 and 1877 was 9 and 10 years old and watching everything. Caroline Lake Quiner Ingalls was born on December the 12th, 1839, in Brookfield, Wisconsin. She was the 5th of 7 children in a family that had already known grief before she was fully grown. Her father, Henry Quiner, died when Caroline was 5 years old, drowned when the boat he was travelling on sank on Lake Michigan. Her mother, Charlotte, raised the 7 children largely alone, then remarried and created a household that was crowded and complicated, and probably, in the way of complicated households, genuinely formative. Caroline was educated, she attended school seriously and was, by accounts from people who knew her, an intelligent and literate woman who valued learning and passed that value deliberately to her own children. She married Charles Ingalls in 1860 when she was 20 years old, and the life that followed was, by any objective measure, among the most physically demanding that an educated woman of that era could have found herself living. She packed and unpacked the household of this family across multiple states and a decade and a half. She maintained in every circumstance, in a log cabin, in a dugout, in a covered wagon, in a surveyor's house on the Dakota prairie, the domestic standards that the Little House books preserve so lovingly. Clean, orderly, schooled, fed, the fire going, the table set properly, the children's hair brushed, the Sunday clothes kept separate from the weekday ones. These things were not trivial. In the 1870s frontier world, they were the specific markers of a family that had not surrendered to its circumstances, the visible evidence that poverty had not become degradation, that the move to the next place had not destroyed the values that made a home rather than just a shelter. For Caroline, who had grown up in a household that had lost its father and had to hold itself together through sheer maternal determination, these standards were not preferences. They were survival tools. And now she was living above a bar. I want to be careful here about something. It would be easy, too easy, to depict Caroline Ingalls in Burr Oak as defeated, or broken, or silently reproaching Charles for the circumstances they were in. That is not what the evidence suggests, and it would not be fair to the woman the historical record actually shows. What the evidence suggests is a woman who was, in Burr Oak, doing the thing she had always done, holding everything together under circumstances that made holding everything together extraordinarily hard. She was pregnant when the family arrived in Burr Oak, or became pregnant shortly after their arrival. She was managing 3 daughters in rented hotel rooms not designed as family living quarters. She was grieving Freddie in a town far from where he was buried, without a grave to visit, without the physical anchor of mourning that the 19th century relied on. She was watching her husband be something other than what his best self required him to be, and loving him anyway, and keeping the household going, and getting up every morning and doing it all again. She gave birth to Grace on May 23rd, 1877, in a brick house on the edge of Burr Oak that the family had moved into after leaving the hotel. The family had moved within the town before that, from the hotel itself, into rooms above a grocery store next door when the Stedmans began to talk about selling the hotel, and then to the brick house. 3 addresses in one small Iowa town over roughly a year. Each move was a small recalibration. Each one told the same story. We are still here. We have not found the permanent place yet. We're managing. We're always managing. Grace was born in Iowa. She was the 5th child and the 4th daughter, and her birth represented, along with everything else a new baby represents, the continuation of the project. The family was still going. Whatever Burr Oak had cost them, it had not cost them that. Laura Ingalls Wilder, the writer, the woman who would produce 8 books that shaped how America understood its own frontier past, was not assembled in De Smet, Dakota territory, in the golden lit years the later books describe. She was assembled in pieces over years in every place the family passed through, and no place assembled more of her than Burr Oak. Here is why. The Little House books are emotionally sophisticated in a way that does not happen by accident. They understand grief that goes unspoken. They understand the specific weight of a father's optimism when the circumstances don't fully support it. They understand what it looks like when a woman makes herself be fine daily and deliberately because the alternative is not available. They understand the gap between the official story, the one the family tells itself out loud, the one that goes, "We are pioneers, we are building something, we are moving forward," and the private story, which contains everything the official one doesn't. That gap, that specific emotional gap between the public face and the private reality. Where do you think Laura Ingalls Wilder learned to see it? She learned it in Burr Oak. She was 9 and 10 years old and she was watching. She watched her father behind the hotel counter, doing work that required him to put a part of himself away every morning. She watched her mother set the table properly in rented rooms, because the table being properly set was one of the things that stood between the family and the feeling of having completely lost the plot of their own lives. She watched her older sister Mary navigate a new school with the particular self-containment that Mary had always used as armour against the world's unpredictability. She watched her little sister Carrie, 5 years old, trying to follow along with circumstances that even the adults were struggling to process. And she carried the absence of Freddie, the baby she had known for 9 months, whose death she had witnessed or nearly witnessed on the road to this town, whose name she wrote about once in a private manuscript and then never again in 8 published books. The child who absorbed all of this became the writer who could hold it, the writer who knew from the inside what it cost to maintain the official story, who knew how much work went into the gap between what you said and what was true, who knew that the pioneer myth was not a lie exactly, but a selection, and that the things left out of the selection were not small things. She knew. And she used what she knew to write the books, and then she used the same knowledge, the same precise understanding of how to manage the distance between the official story and the real one, to keep Burr Oak out of them. It is one of the most quietly extraordinary literary performances in American history. The 1870s American frontier is not what the mythology made it. It was not a landscape of uniformly heroic homesteaders, carving prosperity from raw land through hard work and moral virtue. It was a landscape of staggering economic precariousness, where the line between managing and collapsing was drawn in the weather and the market prices and the luck of what the grasshoppers decided to eat this year, and where a significant portion of the families who had gone west with exactly the same dreams as Charles and Carolyn Ingalls had quietly packed up and gone home, or hadn't made it home at all. Poverty on the frontier in the 1870s was not the same as poverty in an eastern city, where the markers of class and social standing were more legible, and the distance between your circumstances and your neighbours could be measured in visible daily ways. Frontier poverty was more universally distributed. Everyone was poor, more or less, but it had its own internal hierarchies, its own markers of who had fallen further than the acceptable level of general struggling. Working for wages in someone else's building was one of those markers. The homesteading ideal, the free man on free land, building something permanent through his own labour, was the defining self-concept of the rural Midwest in this era. It was the reason people had come west. The land was the point. Owning it, working it, passing it on. That was the whole story. Wage labour was what you did when the story had temporarily gone wrong. It was not permanent. It was not the plan. But it was visible to everyone who saw you doing it, and it communicated something specific about where you were in relation to the ideal. Charles Ingalls, behind the counter of the Burr Oak house, was a man whose story had temporarily gone wrong. And in a small town like Burr Oak, where everyone knew everyone and the social geography of the place was mapped in precise detail, that was not invisible. Laura knew how visible it was. She was 9 years old and sitting in a school full of children whose fathers owned their own farms, whose families had not just arrived from Minnesota because the Grasshoppers had taken everything 3 years running, whose addresses were permanent. She was the girl from the hotel, the daughter of the man who managed the bar. This is not the most devastating thing about Burr Oak, but it is a real thing, and it lived alongside everything else, the grief, the pregnancy, the wrong direction year, in the daily texture of a childhood that the books would eventually skip over entirely. William Stedman and the arrangement he had made with Charles Ingalls was never going to be permanent. The hotel business was slow. Burr Oak was not on a major transportation route, not at the junction of rail lines or river commerce that would have generated the steady flow of travellers a hotel needed to be genuinely profitable. By the early months of 1877, the Stedmans were already discussing the possibility of selling the property. This left Charles in an increasingly uncertain position. He was managing a business he did not own, in a town he had not chosen, under an arrangement that could be dissolved by the owner's business decision at any point. He was, in the economic vocabulary of the era, entirely at the mercy of someone else's calculation. He found additional work. He operated a grinding mill in Burr Oak in partnership with a local man, adding milling income to the hotel management wages. This was characteristic of Charles Ingalls in tight circumstances, restless, resourceful, filling every available hour with work, refusing to let a single source of income be the only source. It did not substantially change the family situation, but it demonstrated the specific way Charles responded to economic pressure. He worked more, rather than worrying differently. When the Stedmans made their decision to sell, the family moved, not out of Burr Oak, out of the hotel, into rooms above a grocery store next door, which was the next available arrangement. The grocery store rooms were still rented space, still not theirs, still one more address in the long list of addresses that defined the Ingalls family's relationship to the concept of home. A few months after that, they moved again, into a brick house on the edge of Burr Oak. This was the family's third address in the town, and it was, by the standards of their Burr Oak experience, a step towards something more like normal. A house, not rooms in a commercial building. A door they could close on the world. A space that belonged to the family's daily life rather than to someone else's commercial operation. Grace was born there, May 23rd, 1877, the fifth child and fourth daughter, arriving in Iowa in a house on the edge of a town her famous sister would never write about. Life in Burr Oak was not entirely defined by what was wrong with being there. That matters, and it is easy to lose in a story that is built around an absence. Laura went to school. She learned things in a one-room schoolhouse with the kind of teacher that small-town Midwestern communities in the 1870s occasionally produced. Someone who had enough education to transmit it, and enough patience with the range of ages and abilities in a mixed-grade classroom to make the transmission real. The school was a place Laura spent hours every weekday, learning and watching and filing things away with the accuracy of a child who already, without knowing it, had a writer's relationship to experience. The family attended church. Caroline Ingalls' religious life was not incidental to her character. It was structural. Sunday services, prayer, the communal practice of a faith that said suffering had meaning and endurance was virtue and God was present even when the evidence of his presence was difficult to locate. These were not optional practices for Caroline. They were the framework within which the rest of life was held together. The Upper Iowa River Valley had established Protestant congregations in Burr Oak by 1876, and the Ingalls family would have participated in the religious life of the community in whatever way their circumstances permitted. This is where Caroline's world, the proper, orderly, religiously grounded domestic world she maintained so carefully, had its most legitimate expression in Burr Oak. In church, she was not merely the woman living near the saloon and the hotel economy. She was a God-fearing woman, a mother of daughters, a member of a congregation. The role fits. Laura watched this too. She watched the way her mother moved between the private shame of their circumstances and the public dignity of their community standing. She watched the gap get managed. She watched the performance of respectable normalcy that coexisted every day with the reality of rented rooms and a bar downstairs and a father who was not building the thing he was supposed to be building. This management of the gap, this daily, exhausting, invisible performance of being fine in public while something difficult was happening in private, is one of the emotional signatures of the Little House books. It is in almost every chapter. Laura describes it with a precision that reads, "Once you know about Burr Oak as the writing of someone who has lived this particular tension from the inside." She had. She was living it in Iowa in 1876 and 1877, and every hour of that experience was going into the archive that the books would eventually open and partially close. The winter of 1876 to 1877 arrived in the Upper Iowa River Valley with the particular authority that Midwestern winters bring when you're not in your own home, and you do not know how long you're going to be somewhere you did not choose. The temperature dropped in November. The river went grey and still. The oak leaves that had been burning red and gold when the family arrived in fall turned loose and fell, and the trees became black shapes against a white sky, the limestone bluffs above the valley going from green to brown to the specific pale nothing colour of the winter limestone in Iowa. The mornings were cold with the deep radiating cold that comes from ground that has been frozen solid rather than surface frozen, and the walk to school would have been the kind of walk that builds character whether you want it to or not. Laura was 10 years old in February 1877. She celebrated a birthday in Burr Oak, something the books do not record because the books do not include Burr Oak, but which happened anyway, in a rented room above a grocery store or in the hotel itself, depending on exactly when the family made the move out of the Burr Oak house and into the next arrangement. A birthday is a birthday whether the books record it or not. 10 years old is 10 years old. What did 10-year-old Laura want for her birthday in Burr Oak, Iowa, in February 1877? We do not know. There is no record, no letter, no account. The archive has nothing for us here except the empty date. But we can say with confidence what she did not want. She did not want to still be in Iowa. She did not want to be in a rented room in a town her family had not planned to be in. She wanted, the way the children of restless families always want, to be somewhere permanent, somewhere that would still be theirs next February. She did not get that in Burr Oak. She would have to wait several more years for De Smet to provide it. But she got 10. She got another year of watching and storing and absorbing, and that in the long accounting was what made the books. The sisters are worth a moment of specific attention, because the Burr Oak year happened to all of them, not just to Laura. Mary was 11 in the fall of 1876, and she was already, by temperament and by the specific social role the family had assigned her as the eldest daughter, the one who managed. She managed her own feelings. She managed her presentation to the world. She was, in the Little House books, the child who did what was expected and found genuine satisfaction in the doing of it, the counterweight of Laura's restless, questioning energy. Whether this characterization is fully fair to the complex person Mary must have been, a character is always simpler than the person, is another question. But the pattern is there. In Burr Oak, Mary would have been enrolled in the school alongside Laura. She would have been in different classes, handling different work, navigating the new social environment with whatever she brought to new social environments, which, if the books are any guide at all to her actual temperament, was probably a careful, self-contained approach that kept her from being an easy target, while also keeping her from forming quick connections. She was 11. She had just lost her baby brother. She was in a school full of strangers. She was the eldest daughter in a family whose circumstances were not exactly what a girl wants to explain to new classmates. Mary Ingalls survived Burr Oak the way she survived most things in her life, by holding herself together, keeping her standards intact, and waiting for whatever came next. What came next was dismet and then blindness, and what she did with that. What she made of a life that had been, by the time she was 15, subjected to more loss and displacement than most people accumulate in decades, is a story of genuine courage that the books trace beautifully, even without the Burr Oak context that preceded it. Carrie was 6. At 6, you absorb the emotional temperature of a household with the accuracy of a very sensitive instrument, but you process it in 6-year-old terms. Carrie knew something was wrong. The specific tension of adults managing circumstances they are not happy about transmits to very small children with perfect fidelity. She probably did not know what it was. She probably clung to her mother more than usual. She probably was, in the way of 5-year-olds in unsettled households, simultaneously oblivious and terrifyingly perceptive. The Little House books give us Carrie as sweet, small, and frequently ailing. The sister who is protected rather than relied upon, who needs care rather than provides it. This characterization runs through the whole series. Whether it was fair to the adult Carrie Ingalls Swansea, who was by all accounts a capable and independent woman who ran a newspaper and raised a family, is debatable. But in Burr Oak in 1876, at 6 years old, Carrie was still a small girl in the middle of circumstances too large for her, holding on to whatever held still. Did Charles play the fiddle in Burr Oak? This might seem like a trivial question. It is not. In the Little House books, the fiddle music is not background atmosphere. It is the emotional core of the family's life. It is what Pa does when everything is hard and the music is the only thing standing between the current darkness and something that feels like hope. Every significant emotional moment in the series is underscored by the fiddle, the sound of it in the evenings, after the work is done and the children are in their beds and the fire is low, saying, "We are still here, we are together, tomorrow is possible." If Charles played in Burr Oak, and there is every reason to believe he did, because the fiddle was as inseparable from Charles Ingalls as his boots, the music sounded different in those rented rooms. Not because Charles played differently, but because the space was different. A log cabin on a homestead claim has a specific acoustic intimacy. The sound of a fiddle in a family's own space, in a house built by the father's hands, has a quality that is impossible to separate from the meaning of what the playing is doing. A fiddle played in rented rooms above a grocery store in Iowa, after a day of managing a bar that isn't yours and grinding grain for wages that belong to someone else's ledger, that fiddle is playing against a different background, the same notes, the same songs Laura had been hearing all her life, but the space is wrong, and the note you hear when a familiar sound plays against the wrong background is the note of the distance between what is and what was supposed to be. Laura heard that note, the writer's ear that would one day describe music with the precision of someone who understood not just the sound, but the emotional function of it. That ear was trained in part in Burr Oak, listening to her father play in rooms that were not theirs, in a winter that was not the winter the family had planned to be spending in this place. The fiddle played. The music said, "We're still here." And Laura, 10 years old in February 1877, listened and understood and stored it, all of it, in the archive that the books would eventually open and close. We need to stop here. We need to slow all the way down, because everything in tonight's story, all of it, The hotel and the grasshoppers and the bar and the poverty and the 3 addresses and the wrong direction year. All of it converges on one central fact. And that fact is a 9-month-old boy who died on August 27th, 1876. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. They called him Freddie. He was born on November the 1st, 1875, in Walnut Grove, Minnesota, the first and only son of Charles and Caroline Ingalls. His older sisters were Mary, 10, Laura, 8, and Carrie, 5. He was the youngest child in the family, the baby of the household, the first boy, the child in whom the specific additional weight of frontier hopes for sons was concentrated alongside whatever more personal love his parents had already formed for him in the 9 months of his life. He breathed. He cried. He nursed. He was held by his mother and probably by his sisters, all 3 of whom had been waiting for this baby, with the particular excitement that children reserve for younger siblings, who are small enough to be treated like living dolls and interesting enough to watch. He was alive in the household in the specific, insistent, daily way that infants are alive. Demanding, responsive, growing, present. He got sick at Uncle Peter's, in the account Laura gave in Pioneer Girl, written more than 50 years after the fact, but with the directness of memory that has had decades to settle into plain language. She described the illness and the doctor and the absence of improvement. She described, in 8 words that have no literary decoration and no need of any, the end of it. He straightened out his little body and died. 8 words, 50 years of distance, still raw. He died on August 27th, 1876. The Wabasha County Death Register, Book A, page 135, records the death of Fred Ingalls, a phonetic rendering of the name, the kind of transcription error common in county records of this era, when the registrar was working from verbal information, with the cause listed as diarrhea. He was 9 months old. He's buried near the Zumbro River in Minnesota, in the churchyard of the community near South Troy, where Uncle Peter and Aunt Eliza lived. The family buried him in borrowed ground, in a state they were leaving, and drove south. In 8 little house books comprising over 1,600 pages of detailed, vivid, sensory memoir covering the entire span of Laura's childhood and young adult life, Charles Frederick Ingalls does not appear. Not once. Not a name. Not a reference. Not a sentence that says, "There was a brother. He was born. He died before we got to Iowa. We drove away from his grave and tried to keep going." Nothing. The absence is so complete that for generations of readers, millions of people who loved these books, Freddie simply did not exist. He was not a forgotten character. He was a person who had been removed from the record that most people ever consulted on the subject of the Ingalls family's life. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it deserves more than being rushed past on the way to the next historical point. A real person was born. He lived for 9 months in a family that loved him. He died. His mother and father buried him in soil they would never come back to. And then his older sister, who grew up to be one of the most careful, precise, emotionally truthful memoirists in American literary history. A writer who described the smell of fresh pine and the weight of a wool blanket, and the sound of a fiddle in the dark with such fidelity that readers a century later could feel those things. That writer did not write his name, in 8 books, through 4 decades of public literary life, not once. Infant death in the 1870s American Midwest was not unusual. That sentence lands hard, and it should, because it represents a reality so different from our own that it requires active effort to hold in the mind without turning away. Infant death in the 1870s. American Midwest was terrifyingly common. Historical estimates place US infant mortality in the range of roughly 1 death for every 5 or 6 live births, depending on population and year. Every family in every church and every school district in every county of Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Dakotas understood what it meant to set a small marker in the churchyard. The community infrastructure for grief, the formal mourning periods, the black dress, the communal condolences, the specific prayers, existed precisely because the grief was this common and this regular, and had to be absorbed into the ongoing life of communities that could not stop functioning because children kept dying in them. This normalization of infant death did not make individual losses easier. The frequency did not reduce the weight. What it did was create a set of cultural forms through which the weight could be expressed and eventually carried without destroying the person who had to keep going. You wore black. You sat in church with your grief and let the congregation see it and share it. You accepted condolences from women who had their own small markers in their own churchyards and who understood because understanding required no translation. You returned to the work of feeding and housing and raising the living children because the living children needed you to, and you understood that returning to the work was not a betrayal of the dead one, but a form of love offered to the one still present. But the Ingalls family could not access most of this infrastructure in its normal form. Freddie died at Uncle Peter's house, not in a community the family was part of, not surrounded by the neighbours and church members whose presence would have made the mourning communal rather than isolated. The family buried him in borrowed soil, received whatever condolences Peter and Eliza and their neighbours could offer, and then, because the hotel was waiting and the money was gone, they left. Within weeks of Freddie's burial, the family was in Iowa. The grave was far away, not accessible, not visitable, not a physical location that could serve as the anchor for the ongoing relationship with grief that 19th century mourning practice required. Carolyn Ingalls, a woman whose religious life gave her specific frameworks for grief, was now pregnant, living in a hotel, managing 4 daughters, and separated from the grave of her son by a distance that precluded anything except carrying the grief invisibly, internally, every single day. This is the particular cruelty of the Ingalls family's circumstances in Burr Oak. Not the poverty alone, though the poverty was real. Not the bar, though the bar was uncomfortable. The cruelty was that the grief had no home, it had nowhere to go. It travelled with the family and had to be held inside the ongoing performance of managing and moving forward, because there was no alternative, and because stopping was not an option that history had made available to people in their situation. Laura was 9 years old and watching her mother carry something that had no place to be set down. She remembered it. Of course she did. She remembered it for 50 years, until she sat at her desk in Mansfield, Missouri, and wrote about it in the manuscript that would become the Little House books. And then she remembered it again, perhaps, when she made the decision to take it out. Here is the question that sits at the centre of everything. Was the erasure of Freddie from the Little House books a single conscious decision, or was it the accumulated result of multiple smaller decisions, editorial conversations, narrative restructuring, the practical challenges of fitting a children's book series around material that was genuinely difficult to handle, that produced an outcome no one person necessarily chose directly? The honest answer is we do not know with certainty. What we know is the sequence of events. Laura wrote Pioneer Girl in 1930. The manuscript included the Burr Oak chapters. It included Freddie's birth and death. It included the hotel and the school and the family's addresses within the town and the general texture of that 14-month period. Laura wrote it all down in the autobiographical manuscript that became the raw material for the Little House books. The manuscript was rejected by multiple publishers. The autobiography format was considered commercially difficult. The material needed reshaping. Laura began working with her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, on the restructuring that would produce the Little House books, a novelistic series told from a child's perspective, shaped for younger readers, built on the particular combination of historical detail and emotional warmth that Rose, as an editor and writer of considerable skill, understood could work commercially. Burr Oak did not survive the restructuring. Whether the decision to remove it was primarily Laura's, driven by the personal weight of Freddie's death and the specific shame of the hotel year, or primarily editorial, driven by the narrative logic of a children's series that needed a particular emotional shape, or some combination of the two operating simultaneously, is not something the surviving record can definitively resolve. Rose Wilder Lane did not leave a detailed account of which specific cuts she recommended and why. Laura's correspondence from this period does not contain a letter saying, "I am removing Burr Oak because of Freddie, or because of the bar, or because it makes Pa look like a failure." The silence continues. It just changes form. But here is what we can say with confidence. Laura knew what she was removing. She had lived through the Burr Oak year. She had written about it. She had chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge, to let an editorial process that removed it proceed without fighting to keep those chapters in. The book that was published without them was the book she wanted published. And the consequence of that decision was this. 3 generations of Americans read the Little House books and never knew about the year the family went to Iowa, never knew about the hotel, never knew about Freddie, never knew that the carefully constructed pioneer myth had a gap in it, right there in 1876, right between the Grasshoppers in Minnesota and the homestead in Dakota, a gap filled with grief and poverty, and a bar downstairs and a baby buried in borrowed ground. Until now, until tonight, until the annotated pioneer girl and the historical scholarship in this room that has been locked for 140 years, the door is open now, and Freddie's name is in the story where it always belonged. Carolyn Ingalls was pregnant in Burr Oak, Iowa. This is documented. Grace was born in the brick house on the edge of town on May 23, 1877, which means Caroline was carrying the pregnancy through the winter months, through the family's move out of the hotel and into the grocery store rooms, through whatever the cold Iowa winter demanded of a woman who was managing 4 daughters and a grieving household, and a husband whose private despair about their circumstances she probably understood better than he fully wanted her to. Pregnancy in 1876 was not the medically managed, carefully monitored experience it is now. There were no prenatal appointments, no ultrasounds, no blood work. There was the specific knowledge that a woman carries about her own body, the patterns of previous pregnancies, the experience of having done this 3 times before under varying degrees of difficulty, and the quiet, constant calculation that women in Caroline's position made every day. Is this baby moving enough? Is this feeling normal? Is everything going the way it needs to go? She was doing this calculation in rented rooms in Iowa, with Freddie's absence present every day in the shape the house took without him in it. With 3 daughters who needed managing and a husband who needed something she may not have been sure she had the reserves to give. With a pregnancy that represented, among other things, the continuation of a hope in a year that had not been generous with hope. The pregnancy was invisible in the hotel mostly. A woman in her 2nd and 3rd trimester in a working hotel setting in 1876 did not announce her condition publicly. The domestic sphere was the sphere where it was acknowledged and managed. In the public areas of the hotel, in the bar, on the street in Burr Oak, Carolyn Ingalls was managing the hotel, managing the household, managing the presentation of a family that was doing fine, thank you, that was managing its circumstances with the dignity that the circumstances required. Private, she was doing something harder than managing. She was trying to find, inside the compressed space of rented rooms in a town she had not planned to be in, with a baby buried in Minnesota and a pregnancy stretching towards spring, the specific resource she had always relied on, the conviction that this was temporary, that the next thing was better, that the forward motion was still possible and still pointed somewhere worth going. She found it. She always found it. That is what the historical record of Carolyn Ingalls' life, read in its entirety, consistently shows. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of endurance so complete and so sustained that it becomes, ultimately, a form of heroism. But Burr Oak is where the endurance was tested most severely and most quietly, and the test never made it into the books. Why do families stay silent about the hard years? This is not a rhetorical question. It is a genuine historical and psychological one, and it has more than one answer, all of which apply to the Ingalls family and to the Burr Oak erasure in ways that deserve direct consideration. The first answer is shame. Not shame in the sense of a moral failing, but shame in the social sense of having fallen short of a standard that the community and the culture held up as the measure of a successful life. In 1870s and 1880s frontier America, the standard was the homestead, the land owned, the house built, the family rooted. When you were below that standard, when you were working wages in a rented building and moving between addresses in a small Iowa town, you were below the standard publicly, visibly, in ways that everyone around you could read as clearly as a ledger. The second answer is protection. Not of yourself necessarily, but of the people you love. Charles Ingalls' pride was real. Carolyn Ingalls' sense of dignity was real. Laura, watching both of them manage the gap between the official story and the Burr Oak reality, was watching two people she loved navigate circumstances that were genuinely hard, and the instinct to protect them, even retroactively, even in a memoir written decades after both of them were dead, is not incomprehensible. It is deeply human. The third answer is narrative. Stories need shapes. The shape of a story about a pioneering family moving west toward triumph cannot survive a full year of retreat, wage labour and infant death without changing into a different kind of story. And the different kind of story, the full, complicated, difficult, fully human story, may not have been the story that the Little House books needed to be. They were written for children. They were written during the Depression. They were written as a specific kind of cultural transmission, offering a specific kind of hope. The fourth answer, and this is the one that sits underneath all the others and does not get said as often as it should, is grief. Laura did not write about Burr Oak because Burr Oak was where Freddie died. Not in Iowa, on the road to Iowa, in Minnesota, in the arms of people the family was leaving behind. But Burr Oak was the destination they drove toward on the day they buried him. It was the name of the place they were going when the baby died. It was the whole enterprise that required them to leave the grave behind and keep driving. To write about Burr Oak was to write about why they were driving toward it. To write about why they were driving toward it was to write about the grasshoppers, and the failed crops, and the sold claim, and the necessity of wage labour, and the whole chain of failure and grief and necessity that had brought the Ingalls family to the side of a road in Wabasha County, Minnesota, burying a 9-month-old boy in August 1876. Laura could hold a lot of hard things in the books. She could write about blizzards and blindness and poverty and failed crops and fear. But Freddie, the specific weight of Freddie's name attached to the specific weight of the Burr Oak year, was the thing she could not carry in the books while keeping the books they needed to be. So she left it out. Both of them, together, Burr Oak and Freddie. Wrapped together in the same silence, kept in the same locked room, for the same reason. In 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder was 63 years old and living at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri. The property she and Al Manso had built into a working farm over decades of marriage. She was known locally as a community figure, as a columnist for the Missouri Ruralist newspaper, as a woman with a specific kind of prairie wisdom that had made her a modest public presence in her region. She was not yet famous in the way she would become. The books that would make her name had not yet been written. She sat down to write an autobiography. She called it Pioneer Girl. The manuscript Laura produced was raw, detailed, direct, closer to a journal than to a polished memoir, closer to the unedited truth of a life than to the carefully shaped narrative that the books would eventually become. It was written in her own clear, plain prose, the prose of a woman who had been writing for publication since her 20s and knew how to put a sentence together, but who was here writing for recovery rather than for presentation, writing to get the whole story down before deciding what to do with it. Burr Oak is in Pioneer Girl, not mentioned in passing, not acknowledged briefly and moved past. The Burr Oak sections of Pioneer Girl are substantial. They cover the family's arrival, their life in the hotel, Laura's school experiences, the family's moves within the town, the birth of Grace, and the eventual departure westward. They treat the period with the same sensory and emotional specificity that characterizes the rest of the manuscript. Actual details, actual feelings, actual people doing actual things in a place that actually existed. And Freddie is in Pioneer Girl. His birth is there, his illness is there, his death is there, in the 8-word sentence about his little body straightening out. Laura wrote it all down. She did not flinch from it in the manuscript. She put it on the page, in her own handwriting, and kept going. The Pioneer Girl manuscript was submitted to publishers. It was rejected. The reasons given were commercial. The autobiography format was considered a harder sell than fiction. For a first-time author trying to break into the market, the manuscript would need significant restructuring. The intended audience was unclear. What the publishers saw was raw material for something better. They just did not quite know yet what the something better was. Laura began working with Rose, her daughter, to figure it out. The working relationship between Laura and Rose on the Little House manuscripts is one of the most studied dynamics in American literary history, and it is genuinely complicated. Rose was a talented writer and a forceful editorial presence who brought real craft to the project of turning Laura's raw memoir into publishable books. She also had her own ideological vision, her own commitments to a specific narrative about what the American frontier meant and should mean, that inevitably shaped the work. Rose would become one of the important voices of American libertarian thought, and even in the 1930s she was strongly drawn to narratives of individual self-reliance, independence, and resistance to dependence. This is not a political annotation designed to cast doubt on her editorial contributions. It is a relevant piece of context for understanding what the Little House books became and what they are left out. The series, in its final published form, is a sustained argument for the heroic pioneer mythos. Individuals building free lives on free land through their own effort and character, resisting dependence on institutional structures, creating through sheer will and love and music what the settled world would not provide. Burr Oak does not fit that argument. It is the chapter where the individual, Charles Ingalls specifically, was defeated by circumstances outside his control and had to accept a dependent situation, working for wages in someone else's building, unable to provide the land-based independence that the myth required. The grasshoppers defeated him. The market defeated him. He retreated east. He took a job. He worked for Stedman. That is not the pioneer hero's journey. It is the pioneer hero's pause, his most human and least mythic moment. And it is exactly the kind of material that the emotional architecture of the Little House series could not absorb without changing into something more complicated and less commercial than what the publishers were asking for. For decades, from the publication of the first Little House book in 1932 until well into the second half of the 20th century, the general public had essentially no access to Pioneer Girl. The manuscript existed in archives, available to academic researchers and biographers who knew to look for it, but invisible to the millions of readers who loved the published books and would have been profoundly interested in the unedited version of the story they thought they knew. Biographers worked from it. Donald Zockert's 1976 biography of Laura used Pioneer Girl as a primary source and gave the first serious public attention to the Burr Oak gap. William Anderson's decades of Wilder scholarship kept the thread alive. But these were scholarly and enthusiast publications, reaching an audience of Laura Ingalls Wilder devotees and professional historians, not the mainstream readers who had grown up with the books and passed them to their children. In 2014, Pamela Smith Hill's annotated edition of Pioneer Girl was published through the South Dakota Historical Society Press. That was the event that changed everything. Hill's edition placed Laura's full, unedited manuscript, with extensive historical annotations, footnotes contextualizing the claims, and scholarly apparatus making the document legible for a general reader, into public circulation for the first time. Anyone who wanted to read what Laura actually wrote about Burr Oak could now simply buy a book and do it. The Burr Oak chapters were right there, in Laura's own words, describing the hotel, the school, the family's moves within the town, the birth of Grace, the texture of the 14 months the published books had simply not included. And Freddie's name was there, in the handwritten account of his illness, in the 8 words about his little body, in the record that Laura had written for herself and then allowed to be removed from the record she gave the world. Hill's edition also enabled a comparison that closed every possible argument about whether the omission was deliberate. You could now hold the Pioneer Girl manuscript and the published Little House books side by side and see directly what had been in the original and was absent from the published version. The gap was not an interpretation. It was a physical fact, demonstrable in the text, available to anyone willing to look. This is the scholarly gift that made tonight's story fully possible. The recovery of the document that proved the silence was a decision rather than an accident. Before Hill's edition, Burr Oak was a known gap, documented in biographies and accessible to researchers. After it, Burr Oak was a demonstrable gap, visible in the primary sources, available to the public whose reading of the Little House books had been shaped by it without their knowledge. Earlier tonight I asked you to keep an image in mind: the hotel register from the Burr Oak house, the documentation of who managed this building, who lived in its rooms, who was present during the period in question, Charles Ingalls' name in that register. Here is why that image matters so much now that we have the full context. The Little House books are the official record. They are what most people know. They are what most people have known for 90 years, what most people will continue to know, what most children will encounter when they first hear the name Laura Ingalls Wilder. The books are powerful, enduring, beautiful, and they do not mention Burr Oak. The hotel register is the counter-record, the physical evidence that the official record omitted. It exists not because anyone preserved it for this purpose. Nobody, in 1876 or 1877, was thinking about the future fact that a famous writer would grow up and not mention this building. The register existed because hotels kept registers. It survived because it survived. Because old documents sometimes do, and sometimes don't. And in this case, the physical record of the Burr Oak house outlasted the editorial decision to erase its most famous residents. Charles Ingalls' name in that register is a very specific kind of proof. Not proof that Laura lied. She didn't lie. Proof that the silence was active rather than passive. Proof that the year happened, that the family was there, that the hotel stood, that the saloon next door pressed close, that the school taught, that the pregnancy continued, and that the grief was carried. All of it, simultaneously, in a place that one of America's most beloved authors decided the world did not need to know about. The ledger kept what the books erased. History kept what the editorial process removed. The building on State Street in Burr Oak, Iowa, stood on its original foundation, while the books that didn't mention it sold millions of copies and shaped how America remembered its own frontier past. That is not a moral accusation. It is a structural observation about the difference between official stories and the material record. Official stories get curated. Hotel registers just sit in archives, being honest. The Burr Oak house waited. It stood there, on its original foundation, full-width front porch and raised basement and hotel register intact, waiting for the story to come back around to it. It took about 100 years. Rose Wilder Lane was born in 1886 in De Smet, Dakota Territory, the frontier world her mother would later immortalize. She grew up knowing what pioneer life actually looked like, in its daily, unglamorous, exhausting reality, and she grew up with a mother who was, among other things, a gifted natural storyteller with an extraordinary memory and a writer's relationship to experience. By 1930, Rose was herself a successful journalist and fiction writer, having worked for Hearst Publications, written several well-received novels, and built a public reputation that was, in some respects, larger than her mother's at the time Pioneer Girl was being written. She was deeply invested in her mother's literary project, emotionally, because the Little House story was her family story, and practically, because she believed the material was genuinely valuable, and that her editorial skills could turn it into something significant. The question of how much of the Little House books was Laura's and how much was Rose's is one of the most contentious in American literary history. Some scholars, notably Roger Lee McBride and later William Holtz, have argued that Rose's editorial contributions were so extensive that she deserves co-author credit. Others, including Pamela Smith Hill and William Anderson, have countered that the essential vision and emotional truth of the books is clearly Laura's, with Rose providing editorial shaping rather than authorial creation. What nobody disputes is that Rose's hand was in the manuscripts. She improved them. She added novelistic energy and scene-making that the original Pioneer Girl prose sometimes lacked. She worked on each book in the series, and her fingerprints are visible to anyone who reads them alongside the Pioneer Girl manuscript. What this means for Burr Oak is this. Whether or not Rose specifically recommended removing the Iowa chapters, she was part of an editorial process that produced books without them. She knew about Burr Oak, she had access to Pioneer Girl, she was working with the same material, and she worked on books that did not include it. Whether she advocated for removal, or simply did not advocate for inclusion, or worked on manuscripts that had already been restructured to exclude the Iowa period before she saw them, this is not fully recoverable from the surviving evidence. What is recoverable is the outcome. The books Rose helped shape did not include Burr Oak. The editorial process that Rose was central to produced a series that, for all its genuine power and truth, carried the Burr Oak gap as though it were not a gap at all, as though the family had simply moved from Minnesota to Dakota without stopping anywhere interesting in between. Rose Wilder Lane died in 1968. She was by the end of her life a significant figure in the American libertarian movement, and a writer whose influence extended well beyond the editorial work she had done on her mother's books. She did not, in any public statement or published account that has been recovered, explain her specific reasoning about the Burr Oak chapters. The silence continues in the next generation. The Little House books were written and published during the Great Depression. Little House in the Big Woods appeared in 1932. The series ran through 1943. These are not incidental dates. The Great Depression was a period of widespread economic catastrophe, displacement, and despair that hit rural America with particular ferocity. The Dust Bowl simultaneous with the financial collapse meant that the farming families of the Midwest and Great Plains were experiencing in the 1930s a version of exactly what the Ingalls family had experienced in the 1870s. Crops destroyed by forces outside their control, farms lost, families displaced, the particular grinding poverty of people who had worked hard and done everything right and still lost. The readers who received the Little House books in the 1930s were not receiving them as pure historical entertainment. They were receiving them as a story about people like themselves, people who had faced disaster and kept going, who had maintained their dignity and their love and their music, even when the circumstances did not support any of those things. They were receiving a story that said, "You can survive this. People like us have survived things like this before. Hold on to what matters and keep moving." That story needed the pioneer myth intact. It needed the forward motion, the optimism, the music, the sense that hardship was a passage rather than a permanent condition. It needed a Charles Ingalls who always pointed west, and a Caroline Ingalls who always set the table properly, and a Laura who grew up to write about it all, with a love so steady it felt like faith. That story could not carry Burr Oak. Not in 1932. Not in the middle of the Depression. Not for the children who needed the books to be the books they were. The publishers who rejected Pioneer Girl and worked with Laura and Rose to shape the Little House series were not villains performing a deliberate erasure of inconvenient history. They were practical people in a commercial industry making professional judgments about what a children's series needed to be to serve its audience and sell its books. Their judgments were shaped by the moment, the Depression, the prevailing mythology, the specific expectations of the children's literature market in the 1930s, in ways that are understandable even when the result is historically a significant loss. The result was the books we know and love, and the result was Burr Oak, locked away in the Pioneer Girl manuscript, waiting for a different moment and a different audience and someone willing to open the door. We are that different moment. This is that audience, and the door is open now. The Ingalls family left Burr Oak sometime in 1877 or 1878. The precise date is not preserved in any surviving record, which is, in its way, fitting. The arrival was not documented in the books. The departure was not documented in the archives. The whole 14 months sits in a double silence, pressed between the official story and the historical record like something kept between pages. What is documented is the direction. They went west. Of course they went west. Charles Ingalls was constitutionally incapable of any other direction for long, and by 1877 the westward pull was particularly strong. The late 1870s saw the beginning of what historians call the Dakota boom, a surge of homestead claims in the territories that would eventually become North and South Dakota, driven by the combination of the railroad's westward expansion, improving weather conditions in the post-Grasshopper years, and the federal government's aggressive opening of new territories to white settlement. The prairie that had punished the family for 3 consecutive years was recovering. The dream was reconstituting itself on the next horizon. The family returned briefly to Walnut Grove. This is documented. Charles found work there as a butcher and then as a justice of the peace. The kind of town-based work that was more respectable than hotel management, but still not the homesteading project he was always trying to get back to. Mary's health deteriorated after this period. She would lose her sight in 1879. The Little House books attributed it to scarlet fever, but modern medical scholarship argues it was more likely viral meningoencephalitis. This is the event that the books treat with devastating restraint, and knowing that it happened in the immediate aftermath of the Burr Oak year, when the family was at its most economically and emotionally exposed, adds a dimension to the loss that the books alone cannot give you. By 1879, Charles took a position with the railroad, then pushing through Eastern Dakota Territory, a job that carried the family to the surveying camp at Silver Lake in what is now South Dakota. De Smet followed, the homestead in Dakota Territory that would become the family's permanent home, the place where Laura met Almanzo Wilder, the setting of the final books in the series, the place where the pioneer myth, after all its detours and defeats, finally arrived at something that looked like what it had always been trying to build. And when Laura sat down 50 years later to write the story of how they got there, she drew the line from Walnut Grove to Silver Lake without stopping in Burr Oak. The wagon went west. The story went with it. Here is the uncomfortable question that the Burr Oak story requires us to ask. What did it cost the Little House books, and the culture that received them, to have Burr Oak removed? Not what it cost Laura. That question has private answers that only she could have given and never did. What did it cost the readers? What did it cost the millions of people who grew up with these books and learned, from them, something specific about what frontier life looked like and meant? The books are not dishonest. I want to be clear about that, because the Burr Oak story is sometimes received, particularly in the context of the broader reconsideration of the Little House mythology that has been underway for decades now, as a simple story of deception. Laura lied. The books are fraudulent. The pioneer myth is a con. That is not what happened. That is not what the evidence shows, and it is not what Burr Oak means. What the books are is selective. All memoirs are selective. All autobiographies are constructions. Every person who has ever sat down to write the story of their own life has understood, consciously or not, that the story is not the same thing as everything that happened. The story is what you choose from everything that happened, and what you choose always reveals something about who you are and what you need the world to understand about you. Laura needed the world to understand the music, the prairie, the specific, hard-won beauty of a family that kept moving forward through circumstances that would have defeated many others. She needed to give that to the children reading her books in the 1930s. Children growing up in the Great Depression, in a country that was in its own Burr Oak moment, stopped and retreated and living in spaces it hadn't planned to be in, trying to find its way back to the forward motion that the national myth demanded. She could not give them that and Burr Oak at the same time. The load was too mixed, the grief too complicated for a children's series. The hotel and saloon world of Burr Oak was too morally complicated for the version of the Ingalls family the books needed to present. The wrong direction year too structurally incompatible with the forward motion emotional arc that the series depended on for its power. So she made the choice she made, and the choice produced something extraordinary, a series of books that has genuinely served generations of readers, that carries real emotional truth even in its incompleteness, that does honour to the pioneer experience even in its selectivity. But the cost is real and should be named. The cost is Pa, made slightly simpler than he was. The man who had to go east and work in a hotel with a saloon next door does not appear in the books. Only the man who played the fiddle and pointed west survives. The cost is Ma, made slightly more serene than the circumstances of her life allowed. The woman who managed grief and pregnancy in rented rooms near a saloon does not appear. Only the woman who set the table properly in a dugout survives. The cost is the full, complicated human picture of frontier life, the one that includes retreats alongside advances, failures alongside triumphs, grief alongside music, poverty in its concrete, daily, material form, alongside the hope that kept the family going. And the cost is Freddie, a real person who deserved to be named in the story his sister told about the family he was part of, however briefly. The Burr Oak erasure does not stand alone. It is connected, scholars have argued, to a broader pattern of selective framing in the Little House books that extends beyond the family's personal history into the history of the land itself. The Little House on the Prairie, the third book in the series, depicts the family settlement in Kansas on land that was, at the time, the Osage Diminished Reserve, legally set aside for the Osage Nation. The book includes Ma's statement that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, one of the most controversial lines in American children's literature, and presents the Osage presence on their own land primarily as a source of fear and tension for the white settler family. In 2018, the American Library Association renamed the award, formerly known as the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, in response to concerns about the book's portrayal of native peoples. The connection between the Burr Oak erasure and this broader pattern is not about equivalence. The erasure of Freddie and the erasure of indigenous humanity from the land are not the same kind of omission, but they share a structural relationship. Both reflect the Little House mythology's need to simplify a genuinely complicated historical reality into a narrative that served the specific cultural purposes the books were built to serve. The pioneer myth required certain things: clear direction, moral simplicity, the land as open and available and waiting rather than occupied and contested. Burr Oak broke the direction. The Osage broke the simplicity. Both were removed from the story the books told. Understanding this does not require condemning Laura Ingalls Wilder. She was a woman of her time, writing from within a set of cultural assumptions so pervasive and so universally held in her world that questioning them would have required a degree of critical distance from her own experience that almost no one in her position possessed. She was also an artist working within the commercial and editorial constraints of the 1930s publishing industry, making practical decisions about what a children's series could carry and what it could not. What it requires is rereading the books with the awareness that they are not, as they have sometimes been taught, a transparent window onto frontier life, but a carefully constructed narrative shaped by specific choices, serving specific purposes and leaving specific things out. What it requires is reading the gap alongside the text, understanding that Burr Oak's absence is as meaningful as every chapter that made it in. The books are still beautiful, the music is still real, the love is still genuine, the human truth in them is genuine, even in its incompleteness. But the full truth includes Iowa. It includes a hotel on State Street. It includes a baby brother's name. We're going back now to the third image I planted at the beginning of tonight, the upstairs room in the Master's Hotel. You can visit that room. The hotel is on the National Register of Historic Places. It is a museum. It is open to the public. The staircase, the one Laura climbed every evening in 1876 and 1877, the one her father used coming up from the bar, the one her pregnant mother navigated in the months before Grace was born. That staircase is still there, on its original foundation, in the building that the books did not mention. The rooms upstairs are plain. They are modest. They are the rooms of a working hotel in a working 19th century town, not a romantic set piece or a dramatic historical landmark. They have windows that look out onto State Street. They have floorboards that creak. They have ceilings low enough that an adult feels them. They are the exact kind of unremarkable domestic space that a family in reduced circumstances would occupy while they were trying to get back to something better. Laura Ingalls Wilder slept in those rooms. She walked up those stairs. She looked out those windows. She carried the absence of Freddie in those rooms and watched her father work in a hotel business he wished he did not need, and watched her mother hold the household together in a space that was not designed for a family and stored all of it in the specific, precise, ruthlessly accurate archive of a writer's memory. And then she locked the door. The building stayed. The door she locked is the one we're opening tonight. When you stand in that upstairs room, when you look out the window towards State Street, you're standing in a piece of American history that most of the people who know and love Laura Ingalls Wilder's work have never been told about. You're standing in the gap in the narrative. You're standing in the year the book skipped. The room was never gone. It was waiting. There is a specific kind of courage in telling the full story, not the dramatic courage of confessing something shameful. Burr Oak is not shameful, not in any way that should be allowed to stand. Poverty is not shameful. Grief is not shameful. A father doing wage work to feed his children is not shameful. A mother holding a household together in difficult circumstances is not shameful. A 9-month-old baby dying of diarrhea in 1876 is a tragedy, but it is not a disgrace. What Burr Oak was, in the mythology that Laura Ingalls Wilder spent decades constructing, was wrong. Not morally wrong, structurally wrong. It was the wrong shape for the story. It broke the arc. It introduced the backward movement, the defeated year. The chapter where the heroic pioneer family was just a poor family in rented rooms near a saloon in Iowa, trying to survive a season that had gone badly, and hoping the next one would be better. That is not the story the books were built to tell. So the story the books were built to tell was told without it. And for a very long time, it worked. The book succeeded beyond anything Laura or her publishers could have fully imagined in 1932. They shaped how 3 generations of Americans understood the frontier. They gave children a specific picture of pioneer life. Warm, musical, forward-moving, ultimately triumphant, that became part of the national cultural furniture, as familiar and as permanent as anything in the American literary canon. But Burr Oak was always there. The Masters Hotel was always standing on its original foundation. The hotel register was always in the archive. The Pioneer Girl manuscript was always in the research libraries. The Wabasha County Death Register was always recording, in a neat 19th century hand, the death of Fred Ingalls, aged 9 months, caused diarrhea, August 27th, 1876. The evidence waited. The building waited. The story waited. And now, in the annotated Pioneer Girl, in the biographies that have carefully documented the gap, in the scholarship that has treated the Burr Oak year with the seriousness it deserves, and tonight, in this room we have opened together, the story has come back. I want to end tonight with the simplest part of this story, the part that has nothing to do with literary history or mythology, or the cultural work that frontier narratives performed in 1930s America. His name was Charles Frederick Ingalls. He was born on November the 1st, 1875. He lived for 9 months in a family that loved him. He died on August 27th, 1876, near the Zumbro River in Minnesota, on the road to a town in Iowa that his famous older sister would spend the rest of her life making sure the world didn't know about. He died near the Zumbro River. The death record exists. The burial was real, even if the exact grave location is uncertain. The name was written in a private manuscript that was not published in Laura's lifetime, written by the sister who remembered him, who chose, for reasons that were complicated and human, and probably not fully legible even to herself, not to carry him into the public books. She made the book she needed to make. She gave America the story America needed to receive. She was, by every available measure, an extraordinary writer and a woman of genuine moral seriousness who lived a hard life with uncommon grace. And she had a baby brother. His name was Freddie. He's part of the story now. He was always part of the story. It just took us 140 years to open the door. The family arrived in De Smet, Dakota Territory around 1879 and 1880. It took a railroad job, Charles, working for the Chicago and Northwestern as a timekeeper at the Silver Lake Surveying Camp, to carry them there, which is its own small irony. The family's final permanent home in the Dakota Territory was reached not by the pioneering homesteading method that defined Charles's self-image, but by taking a wage-paying job with a corporation laying track across the prairie. But it worked. De Smet worked in a way that nowhere else had quite managed to work. The family put down roots. They filed a homestead claim. They built a house. They survived the hard winter of 1880 to 1881, the devastating, nearly lethal sequence of blizzards that Laura wrote about in the long winter with the precision of someone who genuinely did not know, during those months, whether the family would survive. They made it through. Mary went blind. This loss, the blindness that came from the illness described in By the Shores of Silver Lake, reshapes the whole trajectory of the Ingalls family's life in De Smet. Mary could no longer teach school, which had been the plan. She went to the Iowa College for the Blind in Vinton, paid for by the family, by local fundraising, by the specific community support that small-town prairie communities mobilize for their own, in ways that the mythology sometimes overstates, but the historical record often confirms. She learned Braille. She studied music. She lived at the college for 6 years, and then returned home to De Smet, where she spent the rest of her life with her parents until their deaths. Laura became the provider. She took teaching positions at rural schools around De Smet, using her income to support Mary's education, while working toward the life she was building with Alonzo Wilder, the quiet, steady Dakota farmer she had noticed and then loved, and then married in 1885. Rose was born in 1886. A son born in 1889 died as an infant. Laura's later life, the farming, the financial struggles that continued well past the homesteading years, the long project of building Rocky Ridge Farm into something that actually worked, is its own story, full of the same mixture of hardship and endurance and love that the childhood books document. She started writing the Little House books in her 60s. She'd been a journalist for decades, a columnist for the Missouri Ruralist from 1911 to 1924, a writer who understood how to reach an audience and what rural women wanted to read. When she finally sat down to write Pioneer Girl, she was bringing all of that professional experience to the project of turning her own life into something publishable. And she brought the Burr Oak year, she put it in, she wrote it down, and then she let it be taken out. That sequence, write it, then let it go, is the emotional heart of tonight's story in a way that becomes clearer the more you think about it. Laura did not destroy the Burr Oak chapters. She did not pretend they had never been written. They exist in the Pioneer Girl manuscript in her own hand, available to archival researchers for decades before Hill's edition made them public. She wrote the truth, and then consented to the construction of a different, partial, carefully shaped version of the truth for the purpose that the books were built to serve. That is not dishonesty. That is the specific, human, complicated act of a person who understood that different truths serve different purposes, and who made a choice about which purpose mattered most for the story she was telling and the moment she was telling it in. Burr Oak, Iowa, is a small town. Its population has been declining for decades. The 2020 census counted fewer than 200 people in the village. It is not on a major highway. It does not have the name recognition of De Smet or Pepin or Walnut Grove in the Little House geography, but it has the hotel. The Masters Hotel, the Burr Oak House, was in a dilapidated state when it was purchased in 1973 by a preservation group called Laura Ingalls Wilder Park, Inc. The building had been standing for over 100 years at that point, cycling through various uses and varying degrees of neglect, its connection to the Ingalls family known locally, and to Wilder scholars, but essentially invisible to the general public. The preservationists who bought it and restored it and opened it as a museum were working against the grain of the dominant Little House mythology, trying to preserve a site that the mythology had effectively erased from the official map of Laura Ingalls Wilder's life. The restoration was completed and the museum opened. The building was added to the National Register of Historic Places in January 1983. The Laura Ingalls Wilder Park and Museum has operated at the site, with varying institutional arrangements for the decades since. Its website, one of the first results you find when you search for Burr Oak and Laura Ingalls Wilder, describes the town clearly and directly as the missing link in the Little House series. No hedging, no apology. The missing link. The people who have maintained this museum have been doing quietly and without fanfare exactly what tonight's story is doing more loudly, insisting that the missing year was real, that the building is proof, that the evidence exists and deserves to be part of the story that Americans tell about Laura Ingalls Wilder. The staircase is still there. The windows still look out onto State Street. The rooms upstairs are still the rooms where a 9-year-old girl slept in the fall of 1876 and watched Iowa frost form on the glass, and thought whatever thoughts a 9-year-old thinks when she's in a place she did not choose and cannot leave. If you visit Burr Oak, and it is worth visiting, if you love Laura Ingalls Wilder and you want to stand inside the part of her life that the books did not give you, you will find a modest, beautiful, plainly honest building, not grand, not dramatic, not trying to be anything other than what it is. The physical evidence that the year happened. Stand on the front porch, look at State Street, think about a family arriving here in the fall of 1876, tired and broke and grieving, with a wagon full of what they had left, a hotel to help run, 3 daughters who needed school and meals, and another child on the way. All while the adults who were supposed to provide assurance were not entirely sure everything was going to be all right. That family was real. They stood on this porch, they climbed these stairs, they looked out these windows, they lived here, in this building, in this town, in the year that the books did not record. The year is recorded now. Laura Ingalls Wilder died on February 10th, 1957, at Rocky Ridge Farm in Mansfield, Missouri. She was 90 years old. She died 3 days after her birthday, as though she'd been holding on to reach it, which, given what we know about the specific, stubborn, forward-facing endurance of Laura Ingalls Wilder, is entirely plausible. She outlived Almanzo by a little more than 7 years. He died in 1949. Rose outlived Laura by 11 years, dying in 1968. The 2 women who had made the Little House books together lived on into an era in which the books had become something neither of them could have fully anticipated. A cultural institution, a piece of the permanent American literary landscape, studied in schools and collected in libraries and given to children as a gift of the specific kind of understanding that only the best stories can convey. Laura lived long enough to see the books become what they became. She lived long enough to receive letters from readers who had grown up with them and passed them to their own children. She lived long enough to know that the story she had told, the selected, curated, Burr Oak omitting, Freddie omitting story, had done the work she had hoped it would do. What she did not live long enough to see was the annotated Pioneer Girl. That came in 2014, 57 years after her death. She did not see the scholarship that recovered the Burr Oak year and placed it in its full historical context. She did not see the hotel listed on the National Register of Historic Places, or the museum that opened in the building she had lived in. She did not see tonight's story being told. What would she think of it? This is one of the questions I find myself sitting with, and I think the honest answer is, we do not know, and guessing is dangerous. We can observe that she was a complicated person who understood the difference between what should be kept private and what belongs to the public record, and who had made a specific, deliberate choice about which category Burr Oak fell into. Whether that choice, revisited from the perspective of a century's distance, would look the same to her. Whether she would see the recovery of Burr Oak as a violation of her intention, or as the natural completion of a story that was always bigger than any single choice could contain, that is not something the historical record can answer. What I can say is this: Laura Ingalls Wilder was, above everything else, honest. Not honest in the sense of telling every truth to every person at all times. Nobody is honest in that sense, and nobody should be. Honest in the deeper sense, committed to the truth of human experience, to the reality of what people actually feel and suffer and hope for, to the specific weight of lives lived at the edge of what is survivable. The books are full of that honesty. It is what makes them last. The Burr Oak story is full of that honesty too. It is not a story that accuses her or diminishes her, or strips the music from the book she wrote. It is a story that makes her more fully, more completely, more honestly human, which is exactly what she always was, and what the books, in their most essential purpose, have always been trying to make us understand. Donald Zuckert called Burr Oak a crossroads of the spirit. Of all the phrases that have been written about this year, in all the biographies and scholarly articles and historical accounts, that one has lodged in me the most permanently, not because it is the most technically precise. Crossroads of the Spirit is not a historical term of art, but because it is the most humanly accurate. A crossroads is a place where the road forks, where you have to decide which way to go, where the path behind you converges with the paths ahead of you in a single moment of geography and choice, where you can see, simultaneously, where you came from and where you might go. The Ingalls family's Burr Oak year was a crossroads in every literal sense. They had come from Minnesota, from failed crops and a sold claim and a buried baby. They were pointed toward Iowa, toward a hotel they did not own, and a life they had not planned. And they would leave toward Dakota, toward the homestead and the books and the mythology that would outlast all of them. But it was a crossroads of the spirit in the specific sense Zochert meant, I think, because it was the moment at which the pioneer myth and the pioneer reality were most nakedly in conflict, where the gap between the story the family was trying to tell about itself and the story their actual circumstances were writing was widest and most visible and most difficult to maintain. Charles Ingalls in the hotel with the saloon next door, Caroline managing the hotel rooms, Laura at the school in a strange Iowa town, Freddie in the ground in Minnesota, Grace not yet born but coming, carrying the hope of a family that was not done yet, that would go west again, that would find in Dakota territory something that finally, at last, held. The crossroads was Burr Oak, and Laura Ingalls Wilder stood at it for roughly a year and looked at everything it was and felt everything it cost. And then, when the wagon finally pointed west again and the story resumed its forward motion, she filed it away in the part of the archive that was not for public access. Until now. Until tonight. Until the door swings open on a locked room, and what is inside is not a scandal, not a revelation, not a dramatic reversal of everything the books meant. What is inside is simply a family. A real family. In a real place. Carrying real grief and real love and real music in the wrong direction for a missing year that was never going to fit the story, but which happened anyway, completely and irrevocably, and with every bit as much weight as any chapter the books actually included. The Ingalls family was in Burr Oak, Iowa, from the fall of 1876 until sometime in 1877 or early 1878. That is the documented, verified, cross-referenced, materially evidenced historical fact. The hotel is still standing. The register still records the name. The Pioneer Girl manuscript still carries Freddie's name in Laura's handwriting. The year is real. Freddie was real. And tonight, in this room that was locked for 140 years, both of them are back where they always belonged, inside the story of the family that loved them. Here is something that might be the most counterintuitive part of tonight's whole story. The Little House books are better because of Burr Oak. Not better because Burr Oak is in them. It isn't. Better because of what Burr Oak deposited in the writer who made them. The emotional precision of those books. The specific, unflinching truthfulness about what hardship feels like from the inside. The refusal to paste easy resolution over difficulty. The ability to hold love and grief and fear and beauty simultaneously in a single paragraph. That precision comes from somewhere. It comes from a writer who had, from the age of 9, been practicing the skill of holding incompatible truths in the same room. It comes from a girl who had watched her parents navigate a crossroads and learned, from the watching, how to manage the gap between what you say and what is true without losing either. The Burr Oak year made Laura Ingalls Wilder the specific writer she became. It gave her the interior equipment to write about hardships from the inside rather than from a comfortable distance. It gave her the understanding of grief that informed every passage in the books where someone is hurting. It gave her the knowledge of what it costs to keep the music going when the circumstances do not support music, which is the knowledge that makes Pa's fiddle scenes in the books feel like something more than entertainment. Burr Oak is in every chapter of the Little House books. It is just not labelled. It is in Mary's blindness, handled with a restraint that knows grief from the inside. It is in the long winter, where the family's capacity to endure is not presented as easy or cheerful, but as hard and grinding and sustained by love rather than by optimism. It is in the small, accumulated domestic details that make the books feel real, the table set properly in impossible circumstances, the music playing in rented rooms, the forward motion maintained by sheer deliberate act of will. All of that came from Burr Oak. The hotel, the bar, the poverty, the pregnancy, the baby buried in Minnesota, the fiddle playing against the wrong background, the 9-year-old girl watching and storing and learning how to hold a story that was too big for the book she was going to write. Laura Ingalls Wilder gave us 8 books. The 9-month year in Burr Oak, Iowa gave us Laura Ingalls Wilder. Both are real, both are true. And tonight, for many readers, the room where both are visible at the same time is finally open. If tonight's story moves something in you, if Laura Ingalls Wilder's full, human, complicated story is one you want to keep exploring, this channel exists for exactly this. The histories that almost got lost, the silences that turned out to be louder than the words, the rooms that stayed locked until someone asked the right question. If you are not subscribed, now is the time. This is the kind of story we tell here, and the next one is waiting whenever you are ready. Good night.